Xtalks connects professionals in the life science, medical device, and food industries with useful content like webinars, job openings, articles, and virtual meetings to help you succeed in your career. This food industry-focused podcast brings together some of our editorial staff to share insights into the latest B2B industry news to help keep you up to date. This week on the show, we're discussing the federal officials' report of HelloFresh E. Coli outbreak and top food industry regulations to watch in 2022. Enjoy the show.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Xtalks Food Podcast. I'm Sydney Perlmutter, Senior Food Industry Journalist and Webinar Moderator at Xtalks.com, and this week I'm joined by Aisha Rashid and Vera Kovacevic. Thanks for coming today. So I'm going to start us off with a story about some food industry regulations that food and beverage businesses should watch out for in the second half of the year. So food and beverage companies across the supply chain, they always have to be prepared for new regulatory developments this year as they seek to bring new ingredients and products to market. So these new regulations are often reflective of the supply chain, food safety, and consumer trends. So I talk about 4 different ones that food and beverage companies should look out for this year. So the first one is changes to the FDA's definition of the word healthy. So in March, the FDA updated the definition of healthy, which could impact new product development or reformulation. So healthy is an implied nutrient content claim that is defined by the FDA, that is defined in FDA regulations in reference to specific levels of fat, saturated fat, cholesterol, and sodium. The FDA issued a proposed rule that revised the definition of healthy, and the agency began the process of developing a symbol that industry players can use for products that meet the updated definition. So food and beverage companies should monitor this new definition and modify limitations for certain nutrients like fat, sodium, and added sugar. So it'll be interesting to see, an FDA healthy label as opposed to just companies writing healthy. Maybe one will carry more weight. So the second one is labeling clarity on lab-grown meat. So lab-grown meat startups are continuously raising millions of dollars and creating prototypes and improving their technology. And at the same time, they're getting closer to having products being made available. But one question still remains: what can those products be called? So the FDA and the USDA, with their joint oversight over the development and marketing of these products, haven't actually resolved that labeling issue yet. So in October of 2020, the FDA issued a request for information about the names or statements of identity for foods made with cultured seafood cells, and the USDA followed with a publication of an advance notice of proposed rulemaking on the labeling of lab-grown meat, subject to its authorities. However, the clarity and potential alignment from these agencies on this issue in 2022 could still occur in the latter half of the year. But this also is an example of, it's multiple players that often have oversight over things like labeling with food, and especially since this is such a new and burgeoning sector of the food industry, it could still take a while for any more labeling clarity. The third one, however, we've talked about before, so it's about regulating heavy metals in baby food. So in February of last year, a congressional report shed light on a very grim reality of arsenic, cadmium, lead, and mercury, among other heavy metals, lurking in the products of at least 4 baby food companies, and these are major baby food companies. So following this report, baby food manufacturers saw a flurry of activity last year, from the FDA's Closer to Zero action plan to the introduction of the Baby Food Act to consumer class action lawsuits. And I talked about the Baby Food Safety Act and some of these lawsuits in a podcast about whenever this came out in February of last year. But in June, the FDA updated its action levels for lead in baby food and indicated that it would update its action levels for other heavy metal contaminants in the years that follow. However, other stakeholders, including Congress and state attorneys general, are likely to continue to push the agency to expedite its timelines. And especially when we're dealing with something as important as baby food, when we hear something, regulating levels in the years that follow, I think a lot of people are like, that's not soon enough. So maybe we'll see some things a little bit sooner than that. And then the fourth is cannabinoid regulations. So we know that the sale and the use of recreational marijuana was legalized in 2016 in California specifically. So it opened new regulatory pathways separate from the regulations of marijuana to include CBD and other cannabinoids in food products. So CBD, not to be confused with THC, is a non-psychoactive cannabinoid found in marijuana, and it's often found in some food and health and wellness products. So the FDA continues to sort of take this hands-off approach regarding CBD marketed as an ingredient in food or dietary supplements unless health claims are made. But this year, continued acceptance of marijuana and cannabinoids has certainly grown in several states, leading to additional pressure to open the market to CBD in food and dietary supplements on a federal level. So companies marketing cannabinoids should continue to be aware of both the federal ban on the use of CBD in food or dietary ingredients and the rapidly evolving legal landscape. So prior to writing about food, I actually wrote about cannabis in Canada specifically, and CBD is one of those things that is often slapped on a label and makes a lot of health claims. And we were just talking about food clinical trials. So I think CBD is actually going to be a big part of the food clinical trial space in the future. But as for food and beverage companies, like I said, they should always be on the lookout for new industry regulations from the FDA, USDA, and other governing bodies, not only to maintain a positive reputation, but to keep consumers safe and prevent potential safety catastrophes. So yeah, I mean, what are your thoughts on this? Like, as food and beverage companies, do you think that, and I didn't even cover all of the potential like regulations as well, but do you think there's too many to look out for? At the same time, they may not concern all food and beverage companies. These are kind of specific. But yeah, I mean, do you think there needs to be a better way when these things are announced to, for food and beverage companies to actually like follow these regulations? Or is it like too much information at once and it's hard to expect them to keep up?
Well, I think they have like a legal obligation to follow the FDA's regulations, and like I'm sure that every food and beverage company, they have their own internal like regulatory people, or they have support from like an outside vendor, for example, to help them make sure they're following all the new regulations. Because yeah, it is too much for one person, to be constantly like checking up on these regulations, and even to understand these regulations. Sometimes they're very complicated. You may need a team of experts guiding a company.
Yeah, that's very true.
But yeah, definitely, like, for example, the first one, the definition of healthy, right? That may concern a lot of food and beverage companies. But like you mentioned, like the last three are very specific and don't concern a majority of food and beverage companies.
Yeah, I mean, this is really important, and it's really great to see that the FDA is coming out with all of these regulations and for the food industry, because I think, as we've kind of seen with things like, what was that? Pink
sauce.
Pink sauce, and like there's all of these trends and fads and healthy food fads and all of this, with companies just like, slapping on whatever they'd like on their labels and making all of these health claims. And, we've talked a lot about that. So I think the FDA, has the responsibility to step in and really start regulating these things. So I think this is really great. Yes, there are a lot of areas because food is so extensive, right? You have so many different companies, but I think if done right, I think it's going to just be very advantageous at the end of the day for the consumer, so that there is more clarity on what certain labels are, and food companies are held more accountable in terms of what they're putting on their food packaging. And yeah, some of these things are going to be very niche, but I think the onus is going to be on both the food companies as well as, the FDA to work together with companies to implement these regulations and these regulatory standards. But yeah, I think it's it's definitely great. I don't think it's too overwhelming. I guess maybe for huge companies like, well, even Pepsi and Co. I mean, they only have a certain number of products, right? So if something doesn't apply to them, they're just going to go to the niche or to the regulation that applies to them, do a search or whatnot on the FDA website if there's a portal, or I have no idea how this is going to work, but yeah, I'm excited about this, and I think it's much needed.
Yeah, it really is still like, if we're focusing just on labeling and things that companies can say, like it's still such a wild west out there.
Yeah.
Because as it stands, I mean, it's just too big of an industry for the FDA and governing bodies to keep an eye on every single claim that's made. And unfortunately, like a lot of the time, the onus, or I guess the burden, falls on the consumer to like dispute some of these claims. But what's in it for them? You know, it feels like way too tough of a battle. With the case of the baby food, heavy metals in baby food, that was an example of, class action lawsuits, like really serving an important purpose, because who knows if these things would have come about had it not been for consumers, caring for their babies. And same thing applies with adult food, but I just feel like, when there's babies involved who are powerless, it feels like more can get done. But still, we're not, I don't think people are happy with how quickly these things are moving along. So I think the FDA has a lot on its plate, but that's what they're there for. That's what they're there for. Yeah.
And, I think traditionally the FDA has food in its name, but a lot of people do overlook that fact because the focus just seems to be more heavily on the drug side of things. So I think a lot of people do tend to forget the fact that they are also food regulators, and maybe they themselves also sort of not forget that sometimes, but I mean, definitely they are on the, more so on the drug side of things. And so maybe this is just a way for them to be like, hey guys, we are also food regulators and we need to up our game on that side as well.
Well, now the second story is kind of similar, but I'm going to be talking about a E. coli outbreak, specifically having to do with the meal kit company HelloFresh. So earlier this week, the USDA, Food Safety and Inspection Service, or FSIS, reported a public health alert due to concerns that the ground beef in some HelloFresh meal kits may be associated with E. coli. So while the FDA would normally issue a recall, there was actually no recall issued because the products are no longer available for purchase. So that was an interesting thing that I learned as I was writing this, that you can't actually issue a recall if you can't purchase the product anymore, which makes sense. But there's still concern that some consumers might still have it in their freezer if they didn't use it. And they're obviously encouraged to dispose of the product. So according to the public health alert, the meal kits containing ground beef for this public health alert were shipped to consumers from July 2nd to the 21st of this year. And then they stated specific codes that were on the packaging, so consumers can look on the side of the package to see if it was affected. So the CDC is working with the FSIS and state health officials on the HelloFresh E. coli outbreak investigation. However, the CDC hasn't posted any information yet as of a few days ago. So the public health alert comes as federal health authorities in the country are investigating an outbreak of E. coli, with ground beef being the probable source of the illness. So in April, the FSIS announced that the New Jersey-based company Lakeside Refrigerated Services was recalling over 120,000 pounds of ground beef products that might be associated with E. coli. And then just a month ago in August, the FSIS issued another public health alert over concerns that a company called Hawaii Big Islands Beef ground beef products might be adulterated with E. coli. So this problem specifically was discovered by the FSIS during an assessment of the establishment's production records associated with a sample that tested positive for E. coli. So these items were shipped to retail and restaurant locations just in Hawaii. But as ground beef-related E. coli outbreaks continue to pop up, consumers should be aware of the symptoms and seek medical attention from potential exposure to the bacteria. So there are actually specific tests required to diagnose the infection, and symptoms can vary person to person, but often include severe stomach cramps, diarrhea, and even fever. And it's good to note that, these symptoms can be associated with a lot of other things and a lot of other foodborne illnesses as well, and that's why there is a specific test to diagnose it. But the good news is that most E. coli patients recover within 5 to 7 days. However, about 5 to 10% of them can 5 to 10% of the those diagnosed with E. coli can develop a potentially life-threatening kidney failure known as hemolytic uremic syndrome, or HUS. So symptoms of HUS include fever, abdominal pain, fatigue, decreased frequency of urination, small unexplained bruises, bleeding, and paleness. So just in terms of the numbers, according to the CDC, an estimated 265,000 E. coli infections occur each year in the U.S. And around the world, the WHO Global Burden of Foodborne Diseases report estimates that around 300 million illnesses and 200,000 deaths are caused by E. coli each year. So this is not a small illness or rare by any means. Now, in terms of high risk areas, those include a lot of Asia, the Middle East, Africa, Mexico, and Central and South America. And luckily, Canada and the US are considered low-risk areas. But meanwhile, this latest HelloFresh E. coli outbreak kind of serves as a reminder that, you got to cook ground beef to 160 degrees in order to kill any harmful bacteria. And sometimes even cooking it won't kill the bacteria either. So I was kind of surprised that a really mainstream company like HelloFresh was associated with E. coli. And, what kind of, what do you think that does to a company's reputation? Are you less trustworthy of a company that, comes out and says some of our products might have contained E. coli or another foodborne illness? Or on the other hand, is it good that they're not hiding behind anything and they're owning up to a potential, food safety catastrophe there?
Yeah, no, I think both points are very valid in terms of it could, on one hand, boost trust in a company that is taking ownership and, of any potential problems in their food, in terms of contamination. And then, but on the other hand, you could have, a trust issue there as well. But I think for me personally, I feel like these kinds of food recalls have become so common that it's kind of inevitable that a company would be affected by them. So it's not so surprising anymore. It's not like, oh my God, this company is doomed now because they had, a recall over contamination with something or another. I think just with standards nowadays as well, being more stringent and being more, stricter, that is also probably lending to these companies, in their routine check-ins and checkups of their products, that they're finding and revealing these kinds of issues in products and then alerting the public to them. So I think it's just a product of just stricter, testing standards, and it just seems that it's a good thing to me that these companies are alerting the public of these issues early on. And, I think people should be more trusting. At least I think, in my case, I don't find it so surprising anymore. Like back in the day, maybe 10, 20 years ago, if you heard of your lettuce or spinach being contaminated with something, like, oh my God, I'm never going to buy that ever again. But now it seems to be a bit more routine.
Yeah, I also think with the advanced testing capabilities that food companies have nowadays, they can catch things faster and at lower detection levels as well. But yeah, Sydney, this reminds me how a couple of weeks ago you talked about the food traceability rule.
Yes.
And Yeah, actually, I couldn't see meat like beef as one of those foods that the FDA wanted to trace. So I'm just wondering, like, if meat, like especially ground beef, if it has all this E. coli contamination, like why wouldn't they put it as one of those foods that are often linked to foodborne illnesses? They seem to be focused more on seafood, vegetables, and
so beef was not on the
no,
No.
it wasn't.
Oh, okay.
It wasn't, weirdly
Interesting.
enough.
Yeah.
I guess, I mean, I don't know why it wasn't. I guess maybe these other foods are even more prone to like foodborne illness contamination than ground beef. Although, yeah, it's weird. We really have been seeing like a string of E. coli outbreaks related to ground beef. Now, in the research and in the examples I was talking about, luckily, I don't think anyone actually became ill. These were all cases of, E. coli was found sort of after the fact, which isn't good either. Like, luckily no one was, became ill, but it's not like they could issue a recall because it was too little too late sort of thing. It was a retroactive sort of, just in case you bought this particular product in this particular time window, you may want to dispose of it. So, I feel like the ground beef and beef and meat in general should probably have been included in that list. Maybe it was already far too robust to include anyway. That's like a whole other industry, to include. But yeah, I mean, I'm glad that no one was ill from this, but I feel like there needs to be like another sort of, I don't know if like we can use the term recall, but another word for instances like this, like a retroactive sort of recall. Because I feel like these can go even way more under the radar than some even mainstream food recalls. So I feel like a lot of people will have missed things like this just because there wasn't a formal recall. So I wonder if these to me, it's just as important. People can still have this product and don't know,
Yeah, true. And HelloFresh, it's like such a big name, so I wonder the impact this may have on consumers, like you mentioned. I feel like oftentimes when it's a big company, it gets covered more in the press compared to like a smaller company that may have a recall. So perhaps the larger food and beverage companies, they have, I guess, almost like more to lose if they have a recall.
Yeah, and I was thinking too, like, is it fair for consumers to be less trustworthy of a brand, or is it more fair to be skeptical of the food in the first place? Like eating ground beef, for example, or just being more aware of like the fact that you need to cook it to a certain temperature. Like, is it fair to be upset with HelloFresh? Is it really their fault specifically? Or are these certain foods just more prone to foodborne illness outbreaks, and to be more skeptical or aware in terms of safety of these specific foods? So yeah, I mean, I agree with your points, Aisha. Like, it's good that at least they're owning up to it. But yeah, I don't not expect these things either. They're becoming so much more common, which is exactly what we don't want. But we all want food and we all want it fast. And I think, supply chain and, consumer demands, food companies are trying to keep up, and these things can slip under, the radar, no matter how stringent safety is sometimes. I think we're always going to see this. I don't think there will be a world without foodborne illness outbreaks, unfortunately.
Yeah. And, there were so many of them, as I was just saying, it's like, I feel like I can't eat anything anymore. It's like my lettuce is gone, now my beef is gone.
All right, well, that's the end of this episode of the Xtalks Food Podcast. If you like today's show, don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. Thanks, everyone, and see you next week. Bye.
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 Thanks for listening to the Xtalks Food Industry Podcast. If you enjoyed our discussions today, please share the episode with your friends and colleagues and be sure to subscribe in order to be notified when a new episode is released. To join in on the discussion, you can find Xtalks on social media. Email podcast@xtalks.com or comment on the articles directly. Links are in the show description. Take a moment to join our community at xtalks.com to get access to everything we have to offer, including webinars, job listings, virtual meetings, articles, and more. The views and opinions expressed in the podcast are those of the speakers sharing them. They should not be taken as professional advice and do not necessarily reflect the policy or position Honeycomb Worldwide. For further information, email us at podcast@xtalks.com. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next week.